L'Istituto di Diritto Umanitario di Sanremo ha organizzato per il mese di settembre la sua 48esima edizione di una conferenza internazionale dove accademici, politici, giuristi e militari provenienti da diverse parti del mondo discuteranno per circa 3 giorni degli attuali conflitti, di tutte le problematiche nel campo del diritto umanitario internazionale che questi conflitti presentano. Secondo la Croce Rossa internazionale, attualmente nel mondo ci sono più di 100 conflitti attivi, un numero che è cresciuto, sempre secondo la Croce Rossa, dagli 80 di circa 10 anni fa. E questo è un grosso problema per tutta l'umanità del mondo, perché significa che la necessità di rispettare i principi del diritto umanitario è sempre più impellente. Oggi assistiamo a queste guerre dove le vittime principali sono sempre le popolazioni civili, la parte più indifesa e più debole di questi attori passivi, di queste crisi conflittuali. E quindi affrontando con positività la possibilità di migliorare le conoscenze del diritto umanitario internazionale affinché poi vengano disseminate con una maggiore forza e con un maggiore impegno, nella speranza che chi combatte, chi opera, chi si trova in quelle situazioni poi abbia un minimo di sensibilità nel condurre le attività militari. E questo è un po' lo scopo del nostro istituto, che è quello, come dicevo prima, di sensibilizzare le persone che operano in queste situazioni, e soprattutto è un investimento che l'istituto ritiene di fare ed è orgoglioso di fare a favore dei giovani comandanti che saranno chiamati, speriamo sempre di meno, in futuro a trovarsi in queste situazioni. Una sensibilizzazione che permetterà a loro, quando si troveranno a dover decidere come comportarsi con i propri soldati, di ricordarsi di quello che noi gli abbiamo insegnato. È un grande auspicio, noi abbiamo già avuto buoni risultati in questo settore, quindi è un minimo apporto a una maggiore attenzione alla dignità umana dei conflitti che il mio istituto si vanta di fare. Alla presente edizione partecipano più di 200 persone provenienti da 64 paesi diversi, e questo è un grande risultato e dimostra l'attenzione che viene rivolta all'Istituto di Sanremo nel campo dei diritti umanitari.
Distinguished authorities, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's with deep pride and great pleasure that, on behalf of the City of Sanremo, I welcome you all to Villa Ormond for the 48th edition of the Round Table on current issues of international humanitarian law. For almost 50 editions now, this roundtable, organized by the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in close cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross and many distinguished partners, has brought to Sanremo leading experts, scholars, and practitioners from across the world. As evidenced by your presence today, this long-standing tradition has made our city a recognized venue for dialogue, reflection, and the promotion of compliance with this crucial body of law. This year's theme, From Peace to War and Back, putting Istituto Humanitario at the center, capture a challenge that is timely as it is vital. At a moment when international tensions and conflicts remind us daily of the fragility of peace, it is imperative to reaffirm the centrality of international humanitarian law and the humanity in the strive for its accomplishment. IIHL principles are not abstract indeed. They are a concrete shield for civilians, for the most vulnerable, and for the dignity of every human being, even amidst the harshest realities of war. Hence, allow me to extend my heartfelt thanks to the President of the Institute, Lieutenant General Giuseppe Battisti, and to all those who have worked with tireless dedication to make this event possible. I also warmly welcome the many representatives of international organizations, governments, academia, civil society, and the armed forces who are present here in Sanremo or who are following the discussion remotely, whom I know are a rather substantive number. Your contributions are invaluable to ensuring that the law remains a beacon in times of conflict and a foundation for reconciliation after hostilities. Once again, Sanremo is proud to host you in a place, namely our city and more specifically the Sanremo Institute, that has long been associated with peace and international dialogue. I sincerely hope that alongside your important work, you will also find the opportunity to enjoy the beauty and the hospitality of our local society. With this spirit, and in the well-known spirit of Sanremo, I am confident that you will have fruitful discussion in the days ahead. As an elected representative, I wish to stress how much we value your collective efforts as a community of practice in promoting and disseminating the rules of protection that lie at the heart of international humanitarian law. Thank you, and please accept my best wishes for a successful and impactful round table. Thank you.
General Giuseppe Battisti, President of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law, you have the floor.
Thank you, Gaia. This is Gaia number 1. Then we have Gaia number 2, next time Gaia number 3. So it's a team of Gaias in our institution. And we are very proud having this so very professional young girls that make the difference in the work of the men, of course. Good morning, good afternoon again. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends and members, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor as President of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law to welcome you all to Villa Ormond for the 48th edition of the Sanremo Round Table on the current issues of international humanitarian law. When we proposed this year's theme to our colleagues and friends from the International Committee of the Red Cross, from peace to war and back, putting the IIHL at the center, our intention was to underline that international humanitarian law is not merely a set of international rules, with their implementation challenges, potential gaps, and shortcomings, but an instrument able to contribute to making international humanitarian law operational, transforming the rules of war into reality on the ground. Compliance with the IIHL is not only about the protection of human dignity in war. It is also a bridge toward peace negotiation and reconciliation, once the guns have fallen silent. Since its foundation, the Institute has tried to ensure that these principles are put into practice by commanders and soldiers in the field, by humanitarian actors, and by all those operating in the framework of armed conflict. The Round Table has carried forward this mission, serving over the decade as a forum for dialogue, exchange, and shared humanitarian commitment among armed forces, humanitarian practitioners, academics, diplomats, and legal experts. Over the coming days, we will address some of the most pressing challenges in the implementation of the IIHL, the preventive role of its dissemination, the significance of disarmament, the complexity of modern conflict, with hybrid threat, proxy actors, non-state actors, and new technologies and the specific challenges posed by warfare at sea. We'll also look at how compliance with IIHL matters, not only during armed conflict, but also as a catalyst of mediation and peace processes, opening new paths toward reconciliation. None of this would be possible without a long-standing and fruitful cooperation between Sanremo and Geneva, between our institute and the RCRC. And so, let me take this opportunity to once again express my deep gratitude to Eva and to the International Committee of the Red Cross for their invaluable support in preparing this year's conference. Furthermore, I wish to thank the institution who have supported this event, in particular the municipality of Sanremo and this animated civilian society, along with the Liguria region and our many partners, and of course the experts who will enrich this debate with their contribution. A special word of thanks goes to our donors, whose steadfast support, especially in these very challenging times, has been essential to the success of this roundtable. Allow me to extend my sincere gratitude to the staff of the Institute, starting with the Secretary General, Mr. Gian Luca Beruto, Eleonora, Edoardo, Gaia, number 1, number 2, and number 3, and others, and of course my military colleagues, both national and international, for the tireless effort devoted over the past month to the preparation and the organization of this meeting. And finally, let me thank you, our audience. Every September, your active participation is the greatest testimony to the value of the Institute and to its place among the foremost international fora devoted to the study of the advancement of the IIHL. A neutral place where issues arising from conflict can be explored and discussed without ideological and political animosity, thus allowing these issues to address with intellectual honesty and calm judgment. Your continued and we hope growing presence is the greatest recognition of our mission and a powerful support to the reputation of our institution, that a dear friend of mine has defined as a vibrant Tower of Babel, because we receive over 160 people coming from across the world, 160 nations coming from across the world. I wish you all stimulating discussion and a successful roundtable, and I look forward to joining the upcoming panels. The most relevant aspect that emerge during the presentation and discussion will be collected and published in the format of an executive summary on our website and sent to the government, international organization, and media with which we are collaborating, as well as distributed to all the participants. Thank you, and once again, welcome or welcome back to your home in Sanremo. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I don't read, so I prefer to speak in my language. Thank you. Grazie per l'invito. Porto il saluto del Presidente della Regione Liguria, Marco Bucci. Un nostro ringraziamento al Generale Battisti, un saluto al Sindaco Magar e a tutti voi. Credo che stiamo vivendo tutti un periodo estremamente delicato e difficile.
Il mondo non è mai stato così a rischio dalla fine della Seconda Guerra Mondiale. I popoli sono divisi. Ha preso forza l'autoritarismo, la prepotenza e l'arroganza. Stiamo facendo vedere ai nostri giovani come non deve essere il mondo. Stiamo dando una pessima lezione. Muoiono ogni giorno migliaia di bambini innocenti. Le bombe oramai sono la cronaca giornaliera di ogni telegiornale internazionale e noi guardiamo scene drammatiche senza renderci conto che tutti siamo coinvolti, che tutti siamo colpevoli. Io mi auguro che i governi mostrino quanta alta debba essere la politica internazionale, che si vada oltre il nazionalismo, la guerra religiosa e si veda più lontano, ognuno con le proprie idee, ma rispettando gli altri. Senza il rispetto fraterno sarà una guerra continua e non ci sarà vittoria per nessuno. Grazie all'Istituto di Diritto Internazionale Umanitario per aver accolto così tante autorevoli personalità e per questo confronto che ci vede oggi tutti insieme, ma anche qui da Sanremo, una città storica, anche da un punto di vista di politica internazionale, per gli incontri che Sanremo ha ospitato tante volte, possa alzarsi un grido che debba dire insieme la parola pace. Basta guerre, rispetto per i popoli, rispetto per tutti e la volontà di costruire insieme un mondo migliore per i nostri figli che io credo non meritano di subire i nostri errori. Thank you very much. Buon lavoro.
Now, Mr. Gian Luca Beruto, Secretary General of the IIHL, will deliver a message on behalf of the Mayor of Solferino, Mr. Germano Vignocchi.
Authorities, distinguished speakers, dear guests, it's a great honor for me to convey this message on behalf of the community of Solferino at this important international conference organized by the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross and dedicated to such a crucial issue. I wish to extend my warmest regards to two personal friends, as well as friends of Solferino, General Giuseppe Battisti, President of the Sanremo Institute, and Rosario Valastro, President of the Italian Red Cross, our honorary citizen and tireless advocate of the values that bind our territory to the great international humanitarian family. Due to prior commitments, I regret not being able to attend the roundtable in person, but I will be following the works with great interest. The expertise and authority of the speakers are truly commendable. The ongoing work of the prestigious Sanremo Institute makes a significant contribution by offering analysis and insights of great relevance, while recognizing that much remains to be done on issues concerning international humanitarian law and its application. Solferino is a small town, but its history has resonated across the world for centuries. In 1859, one of the bloodiest battles in modern history gave birth to a revolutionary idea, transforming suffering into solidarity and pain into the rules of civilization. From there, from the brilliant intuition of Henri Dunant, the movement of the Red Cross was born, together with the very foundation of what we now call the International Humanitarian Law. That message, born more than 160 years ago,
does not belong to the past alone. It remains strikingly relevant and urgent today. In the face of the wars and tensions that continue to plague the world, the memory of Solferino is not a distant echo, but a living lesson, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, there are limits that must not be crossed and people who must be protected. This conference is a clear demonstration of that message. In your discussions, you will address how international humanitarian law can help prevent conflicts and contain violence, how disarmament and arms control instruments can foster trust, and how new challenges, from emerging technologies to the transformations of modern warfare, demand a constant commitment to defending fundamental human values. At the same time, you will reflect on the role of mediation, the contribution of women to peace processes, and the importance of reaffirming humanitarian rules in all contexts, during conflicts and in their aftermath. All these issues share a common thread, the idea born in Solferino, which has never been more relevant than today. It reminds us that peace is not merely the absence of war, but is built upon respect for the dignity of every human being. As Mayor of Solferino, I feel it is my duty to preserve and pass on this universal heritage, a responsibility I embrace with commitment and, above all, with passion. It is therefore a great pleasure to share my hope that a collaboration between the City of Solferino and the Sanremo Institute will soon take shape, giving rise to joint projects. I have already discussed this with the President of the Institute, and we are fully committed to make it a reality. Together, through memory and research, history and the future, we can continue to spread the principles of international humanitarian law and make them more tangible. The history of Solferino teaches us that from great tragedy, light can emerge. That light of humanity, first lit in 1859, continues to shine today, illuminating the path of humanitarian law and guiding all those who, like you, are dedicated to limiting suffering and building peace. It is a light that belongs not only to Solferino, but to the entire world. And I am sure that your work will help keep it alive, strong, and capable of guiding our future. With this spirit, I wish you a very success in your work, confident that these days will inspire new ideas, new energy, and new hope for a future of peace and justice. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion.
We will now watch a recorded message by Ms. Mirjana Spoljaric, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Colleagues, distinguished guests, we are living in a time that is increasingly marked by war. Today, there are approximately 130 armed conflicts classified by the ICRC across the world. This is more than we saw a year ago and far more than in previous decades. 10 years ago, for example, in 2015, we counted approximately 80 armed conflicts. Creating the conditions for peace is one of the most important responsibilities of states. And yet, we are witnessing a vacuum of both moral and political courage to stop the killing. For over 160 years, the ICRC has worked in nearly every major theater of war. We know armed conflict intimately, what it does to civilians, to families, to communities, and to nations. I am convinced that respect for international humanitarian law, combined with neutral, impartial humanitarian action, can help remove the obstacles to peace and lay the foundations for reconciliation. The way wars are fought influences how they end. When the boundaries of warfare are pushed, when fighting is waged with the goal of total annihilation, the human cost grows exponentially and the seeds of future violence are sown. Conflicts are far too often fought with permissive, and what I find worse, dismissive, interpretations of the rules of war. And this is not an abstract issue. It irreversibly impacts the lives of millions of people across the world. When cities are leveled, when hospitals are bombed, peace becomes harder to attain and recovery far more costly. But when respected, IIHL prevents senseless brutality in war. It restrains our worst instincts. It affirms the fundamental truth that every human life, no matter what side of the front line they live on, is equally deserving of protection. When combatants respect the rules of war, when they spare civilians, protect critical infrastructure, and care for the wounded, they reduce the long-term costs of conflict. They make recovery possible and preserve the social fabric that is necessary for peace. The ICRC has been mentioned in about 150 peace instruments since 1934, recognizing our role as a neutral intermediary in implementing the humanitarian provisions of the Geneva Conventions. These include releasing and repatriating prisoners of war, clarifying the fate of missing people, and handling the mortal remains with dignity. As one negotiator once told us, there are 100 steps to peace. The first steps are humanitarian. Dear colleagues, today, in a decade marked by war, states must join forces to reignite the vision of lasting peace and stability based on internationally agreed frameworks and a rules-based world order. The rules remain in principle, but the commitment to uphold them is weakening with catastrophic consequences for people trapped in conflict. International law is always only as strong as the political weight that is given to it by state leaders. And this is why last September, the ICRC, together with Brazil, China, France, Jordan, Kazakhstan, and South Africa, launched an initiative to galvanize political commitment for the rules of war. In the meantime, more than 70 states have joined us in this effort. But I call on all states to do the same. Initial consultations with official representatives and practitioners highlighted that when IIHL is integrated early in peace negotiations, it can foster trust, open space for humanitarian dialogue, and serve as a foundation for lasting political agreements. Your discussions over the next 3 days are important. They are an important part of this collective effort to preserve the protective power of IIHL for future generations. I thank you, and I wish you all the best for your discussions.
Ms. Isabelle Rosa Brunetto, Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of the Principality of Monaco. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, signore e signori, I will speak in my official language, which is French, so I hope you will understand through the equipment that you have been provided if needed. Mesdames et messieurs, en vos éminents grades et qualités, je vous remercie de l'opportunité donnée à la Principauté de Monaco de prendre part, en tant que voisin et en tant qu'ami, à la cérémonie d'ouverture de la 48e table ronde organisée par votre institut sur le droit international humanitaire. Je tiens à vous transmettre les salutations les plus cordiales de Son Altesse Sérénissime, le Prince Albert II de Monaco. Il vous remercie de l'invitation que vous lui avez adressée et regrette de ne pouvoir être parmi vous aujourd'hui. En sa qualité de chef d'État, mais aussi de président de la Croix-Rouge monégasque, le prince incarne, à double titre, un ardent promoteur des relations apaisées et constructives entre les peuples et les nations. Mesdames et messieurs, l'an passé, Madame Isabelle Béraud-Amadei, vous avez les Gaïa, nous on a les Isabelle, ministre des Relations extérieures et de la coopération, était ici même afin de réaffirmer le soutien du gouvernement princier aux travaux de votre institut, à l'occasion du 75e anniversaire des Conventions de Genève. Aujourd'hui, en prenant part à cette table ronde, je souhaite à nouveau dire tout l'attachement de la Principauté aux objectifs de l'Institut international de droit humanitaire de Sanremo. Dans un contexte mondial marqué par une intensification des conflits, Madame Spoljaric vient nous le rappeler, il est plus que jamais nécessaire de rappeler et de promouvoir le respect du DIH. Ce droit doit constituer un instrument de dialogue et un garde-fou essentiel pour prévenir que les différends politiques ne dégénèrent en affrontements meurtriers. La Principauté a ratifié les 4 conventions de Genève ainsi que leur protocole additionnel. La politique internationale menée par Son Altesse Sérénissime le Prince Albert II s'inscrit dans cette perspective et nous engage résolument dans une solidarité active face aux conséquences des conflits. Depuis près de 20 ans, sa volonté est de renforcer la coopération au développement, en particulier au bénéfice d'une dizaine de pays parmi les moins avancés, et d'accroître l'appui apporté aux activités du HCR, dont nous sommes le premier bailleur per capita, et au CICR. Nous aurons d'ailleurs la visite de Madame Spoljaric dans quelques semaines en Principauté de Monaco. Nos partenariats témoignent de cette réalité. La multiplication des conflits, en brisant les chaînes logistiques, entraîne une aggravation des crises, ainsi qu'une insécurité alimentaire et sanitaire pour les populations concernées. Mesdames et messieurs, ce qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, c'est le respect de la vie et de la dignité humaine. Hélas, chacun le constate, les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains s'aggravent. Par ailleurs, dans les années à venir, les effets déstabilisateurs du changement climatique risquent de devenir une source supplémentaire de tensions et de conflits. C'est pourquoi les recommandations et les messages issus de ces 3 journées de travaux, d'échanges, d'expertise et de partage d'expériences devront proposer des pistes concrètes pour mieux promouvoir le DIH dans la prévention et le règlement des conflits, ainsi que pour assurer une protection accrue des populations civiles. Soyez assurés que la Principauté de Monaco s'en fera l'écho. Je vous souhaite à tous de fructueux travaux et je vous remercie.
Mr. Rosario Maria Gianluca Valastro, President of the Italian Red Cross, please take the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished authorities, dear colleagues and friends, I would like to thank the International Institute of Humanitarian Law and its President, General Battisti, for inviting me to speak again this year at the opening of the Sanremo Round Table. It is a great honor for me to be here with you today. This time last year we were here commenting on the historic moment we are living through, deeply shaken by the alarming developments taking place on the international stage, with particular reference to armed conflicts and their tragic impact on civilian population in many countries around the world. Ours was a stark and a dramatic realization. Too often, the basic principle of humanity seemed to be disappearing, giving way to the logic of oppression and annihilation of other human beings considered the enemy. A year later, the situation is even worse, if that is possible. The total disregard for the basic rules of international humanitarian law and the concomitant commission of war crimes, which has becoming systematic in many contexts, from the Middle East to Ukraine, is shocking. However, as we constantly repeat at the Italian Red Cross and with our sister national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies involved in conflict scenarios, we cannot allow ourselves to be discouraged by what is happening. On the contrary, the current reality must strengthen our conviction that the role of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, of which we are a part, is now more necessary and decisive than ever. Today, we are more resolute than ever on all fronts and at all levels. Let me briefly mention just a few recent and concrete examples of the commitment. In a few days' time, a bilateral agreement between the Italian Defense Staff and the Italian Red Cross will be signed in Rome. This is a formal 4-year commitment based on shared desire to cooperate on achieving the objectives contained in the pledges presented jointly by the Italian government and the Italian Red Cross at the 34th International Conference of Red Cross and Red Crescent held in Geneva in October 2024, dedicated respectively to strengthening the dissemination and implementation of international humanitarian law and international disaster law, and strengthening the protection and inclusion of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including armed conflict and disasters. The agreement provides for coordinated and synergistic action by the respective organizational and territorial structures, aiming at consolidating our substantial role in IIHL, training for the Italian armed forces, and at implementing high-profile institutional initiatives and activities. Among these, the drafting of a military manual of international humanitarian law applicable to military operations, which is now in its final stages, and is the result of a collective effort by the working group set up by the Italian Ministry of Defense, including numerous experts from the Italian Red Cross. The military manual, if approved by the authorities, as I hope it will be, will serve as a reference point of IIHL for all relevant national operators for the years to come as an updated and comprehensive tool for the effective implementation of IIHL, which will be decisive in strengthening training and dissemination at all levels. Finally, our constant and relentless endeavor is on IIHL dissemination in peacetime. Activities aimed at spreading and strengthening IIHL awareness among relevant institutions and the civil society, especially towards the younger generation, continue to represent an essential field of action for us, as set out in our 2030 strategy. Students are indeed a critical target. Our main initiatives to promote IIHL to the civilian population in peacetime are aimed at secondary schools. These include the 4th edition of our IIHL national competition held this year in Rome, which involved over 120 young people from 18 regions of Italy. It is also through these concrete initiatives and activities that we believe the reconstruction of a culture of respect for international humanitarian law can be achieved. This is, and needs to remain, a collective effort of thousands of volunteers, institutions, and organizations in Italy and abroad. Only if we work together, we can ensure that humanity, our foremost principle, is never called into question by any conflict, by any dispute, anywhere, at any time. Thanks, President Battisti, once again for this invitation to this wonderful Villa Ormond, and I wish everyone 3 days of fruitful discussions and reflection.
It is now time for our keynote speech, delivered by Professor Marco Sassoli, Professor of International Law at the University of Geneva and member of the IIHL.
Thank you, Mrs. De Salvo. Thank you to the Institute to have invited me. I feel very honored to deliver a keynote speech when I was for the first time at the Sanremo Round Table 40 years ago. This doesn't make me younger. I wouldn't have expected to one day deliver a keynote speech. Although it's a difficult time for international humanitarian law, but I would say more generally for international law and for the rule of law, including in many countries. And I would even argue that international humanitarian law is better off than other branches of international law. Think about international trade law. Even the victims of violations do not dare to invoke that there was a violation of the WTO rules. Think about international environmental law, where there is an increasing number of governments and in public opinion who simply deny that there is a problem, like global warming. Think about international human rights law, where basic human rights are not only violated, us also in IIHL, but are contested, are denied that these are human rights. Alternative concepts are brought forward. Well, there I would say, as far as I see in international humanitarian law, but I come back to that, there are many violations, but those who violate nearly always claim that either the facts are wrong, therefore they recognize the rule that it is prohibited to target civilians, for instance, or they have an interpretation based on humanitarian law. I come back to permissive interpretations. Now, it is true that it would be astonishing if rules applicable to armed conflicts were perfectly respected. Because international armed conflicts only happen if a fundamental rule of international law which prohibits the use of force in international relations is violated. And I would argue, but we could have a round table on that, that non-international armed conflicts would nearly never happen if human rights were respected in peacetime. And in a time of armed conflict, the survival of the individual and of the group is at stake, and therefore it would be astonishing if the rules applicable were always perfectly respected. In addition, and this will be more controversial, I would say we have an erroneous impression that IIHL, and a dangerous impression that IIHL is always violated, which undermines the readiness to comply with the rules. Obviously, understandably, the media, the NGOs, international tribunals, they don't deal with cases of respect. They deal with the violations. But this could leave public opinion with the impression that these rules are never respected. And it's very difficult to prove the opposite. I can only speak about the last millennium. Last century, when I worked for the ICRC, I saw in armed conflicts also many, many instances of respect. And I know we shouldn't mention countries, but it's last millennium. So, for instance, in the terrible war between Iran and Iraq, such an inhumane regime than that of Saddam Hussein nevertheless respected Iranian prisoners of war more or less in conformity with the Third Geneva Convention. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I negotiated with Bosnian Serb military officials, and we know what some Bosnian Serbs did. But I had also plenty of people who knew, thanks to their training in the Yugoslav People's Army, International Humanitarian Law made all kinds of arguments, but arguments are made also today by much more respected armed forces. But you cannot say that they didn't care about. Another problem of perception is that perhaps too much is expected from international humanitarian law, especially if you call it humanitarian. The idea that if international humanitarian law was respected, there wouldn't be anyone suffering in an armed conflict. No, there would be plenty of combatants killed, wounded, but also civilians. As long as the proportionality rule and feasible precautions are taken, there would be plenty of civilians killed. And as for forced displacement, I know we shouldn't mention countries, but it's now a pure hypothetical, fortunately. Imagine France attacks Italy. And the French armed forces, thanks to all the French officers in this room, would perfectly respect IIHL, but they would come near Sanremo from Bordighera. I think, nevertheless, a lot of inhabitants of Sanremo would flee towards Genova. Therefore, and I think it sounds like an offense to the many victims of violations, but we should also remind that life and dignity of all can only be respected in time of peace. And in time of war, there will be suffering, and humanitarian law can only guarantee or hope to guarantee a minimum of humanity in a profoundly inhumane situation. Finally, there is a problem, and I think an increasing problem of distinguishing what sounds very technical, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. The idea that both the aggressor and the victim of aggression, the occupier and the occupied, the terrorist movement and the democratic government, the dictatorial government and an armed group fighting for the liberation of people have to comply with the same rules is essential in my view, but less and less accepted also in public opinion, and this creates a further dividing line. Now let's speak about humanitarian law and the substance of humanitarian law. It sounds also an offense to the many victims if I agree with the ICSC that the existing IIHL is more or less fit for purpose. It's not only the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Since then, it has developed. There are the additional protocols, there are several weapons treaties, there are several clarifications. Now, there may be exceptions. Some of them are purely technical and have no great impact on the war victims, like the prohibition for hospital ships to have a code, or the amount of Swiss francs a prisoner of war may have. That even the Swiss franc is no longer so much worse. But these are details. Probably technology, and it is often said today that technology has totally revolutionized warfare, which is true, and that this makes somehow international humanitarian law outdated. I belong to an old school, which is the school of Roman law, that rules apply also to situations which were never foreseen by the legislator. And I admit that I have some doubts on cyber warfare. which is indeed in an environment which is so different from the environment which was seen by those who made the current international law, that probably we would need rules, but that doesn't mean that in the meantime we cannot apply the principles of the existing rules. The ICSC would add artificial intelligence. I'm not so sure. I think, yes, we can develop, but the existing rules of IIHL can be applied and correctly interpreted to apply to the use of artificial intelligence. Another substantive problem is humanitarian assistance, because I don't have to remind you that humanitarian assistance may be limited to civilians, and that the party letting humanitarian assistance through may insist on control that it is actually distributed to civilians. And this cannot be guaranteed by anyone, and so probably we would need new rules on that, but don't ask me how these rules could work, because I don't think that the rules which require to feed your enemy while the enemy is fighting will ever be accepted by states. Then there's the issue, and it was mentioned, of manipulation of the existing rules. I think there is manipulation in both senses, in the sense of interpretations which are contrary to the object and purpose of IIHL, and interpretations for the good cause which make warfare impossible and will therefore not be respected in a warfare. And for the first, we hear today a lot about permissive interpretations of IIHL, and they are put nearly on the same level than violations. I think we have to distinguish three things. First of all, and this was very well described by one of my former doctoral students, who is now in the ICSC responsible to implement the global initiative UNCTAD, that IIHL is basically a prohibitive rule ensemble of rules, and there are only very few authorizing rules, but obviously permissive interpretation can also be of prohibitive rules by interpreting them in the way that they do not prohibit what we find very shocking. There, I think we have to distinguish those interpretations which are simply wrong, and we have to fight against them, and those interpretations where you can have different approaches. And I give you an example of something where I have a very firm opinion. It's about the legality of detaining persons in a non-international armed conflict. Nevertheless, and I have recently written on that, I don't think that someone who doesn't agree with me and detains people contrary to what I suggest is the correct interpretation commits the war crime of unlawful confinement. We have to admit that there are different interpretations and simply fight with argument for the right interpretation. Now, obviously, there could be better, more humanitarian rules, but A, I don't think they would be accepted by states, and B, we have always to remember that IIHL applies to armed conflict and must make it possible to fight for a lawful reason, like self-defense. And therefore, they cannot be as humanitarian as we would wish. If we want to be really humanitarian, don't make war. Remain in peace. Now, the main problem is implementation or enforcement, and this is a general problem of public international law. In humanitarian law, I must unfortunately admit that there are widespread violations of IIHL. being an ancien combattant of the round tables, I have to tell you that in these 40 years I was not always present. I have never seen a year where the round table said this was a good year for IIHL and everything was respected. So unfortunately, this is not so new. It may be that quantitatively there are more violations also. I would like to have historians analyzing this more seriously. Anyway, for the enforcement, we have to admit that there are widespread violations, and there is at best a selective, and in old Italian courtrooms it was always written la legge è uguale per tutti. If it is selective, it undermines the credibility of the law. The international community has a selective approach in enforcing international humanitarian law. Now we have mechanisms. We have the International Committee of the Red Cross, which does an admirable job in the field, has chosen for very good reasons to work confidentially and to try to convince, because it has no weapons, and even if it had weapons, I would not suggest that it uses weapons, because this means killing even more people. So, but this means that it will only exceptionally criticize violations by mentioning also who is responsible, which the ICSE often knows. Beyond that, most mechanisms do not function because there is no political will to make them function. And in my view, nearly the best example is the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. We have the Vice President in this room, which would be so useful because in most cases, in case of violations, it's not a question of whether this was correctly interpreted, the law, but it's simply about the facts. And to establish the facts by an independent, permanent body would be so important, but states do not want to have it working in its traditional fact-finding mandate. The United Nations, my former students, because I have to say, you always mention me as a professor, I'm a retired professor since 1 year. My former students were very critical of the United Nations, and I told them, no, don't demonstrate against the United Nations, demonstrate against your government, because it's governments who decide what the United Nations do. And therefore, they have to be selective, and therefore, they cannot be as efficient as we would wish. Nevertheless, I would say that, for instance, the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, not ideal. I would wish special procedures on IIHL, but states do not want that. Do a good job in finding violations, in denouncing violations. And the humanitarian organizations of the UN family do also an astonishingly good job thinking about the states who are behind them, and even the Secretary General is. And even more, the High Commissioner for Human Rights are courageous, taking into account that they have their bosses, which are the states. Article 1 common, the obligation to ensure respect, which is also an obligation of third states. One cannot say nothing happens, but again, it is insufficient and selective. And here comes again la legge uguale per tutti. This undermines what is done because it's not done in other cases. In addition, I would like to hammer on the states that it is not that you must influence your adversaries, you must influence your friends. Now, often I hear, and this is an argument, to say, yes, Marco, but you don't know what we do. And I agree, I cannot know what they confidentially discuss with another state to convince the state to comply with IIHL. But words are not sufficient. There is also sometimes action necessary, and action cannot be confidential. There cannot be targeted sanctions which are confidential. They have to be published. And the prohibition to import goods from certain places cannot be confidential. And there I see very little. Let's come to international criminal law, which is a great hope for the enforcement of international law. Nevertheless, and I think this is very depressing, that even in democratic states governed by the rule of law, there have been nearly no final conviction for war crimes of their own officials and soldiers. Universal jurisdiction works a little better. There has been progress in recent years, mainly on situations which were not so politically delicate. And finally, the International Criminal Court has a difficult job, is often lost in procedural niceties and a lot of bureaucracy. Nevertheless, in my view, but many of you will disagree, it has gained credibility in the last 2 years, because no one can anymore say that it is only looking after African rebels. And that reinforces the credibility, again, la legge è uguale per tutti. Now, what remains with all this is prevention, I think. And here, obviously, the Sanremo Institute has and does a great job in dissemination, in training of armed forces, of the civilian populations, of judges, of prosecutors, that IIHL is known. And the next step is then to make sure that it is actually applied. And knowledge is the first step, but even a professor admits that it is not the final step. I think a challenge we should all think about is, if, here I give no name, a country attacks Italy, bombs Catania, half of Catania is destroyed, it then occupies Catania. I don't recommend anyone to occupy Catania. If you know Catania, it's a difficult place to occupy. And then 500 women are raped. And to be gender correct, 15 men. Okay. How do we make sure that the Italian soldier will nevertheless treat the first combatant of those forces who did that in conformity with the Third Geneva Convention? I think this is a challenge which, unfortunately, lawyers cannot help. But others should help, psychologists, anthropologists, and so on. And it would be an important challenge. Then I think, nevertheless, it is important to underline, which is not very popular, that IIHL is not about your friends. Be nice with your friends and your comrades in school and so on. IIHL is to respect enemies, bad people, people who did terrible things to your country, to your group, to your family, and so on. And this is a difficult message. But I'm optimistic in the sense of Hubert Beuve-Méry, who then became the editor of Le Monde in France in 1942. In Nazi-occupied Paris, he wrote, "C'est au plus profond de la nuit qu'il faut croire à la lumière." It's in midst of the darkest night that we have to believe in light. And croire in this is not believe because we hope, but we all know at 2 o'clock in the morning, when it's totally dark, that the light will come again in the morning. And this is the core, I think, we have to have, that it is necessary that better times for IHL come up, except if we do no longer need IHL because there's peace, which would be even better. But it is necessary because what is the difference between war and crime? War is fought according to rules. Really, I don't see. Well, there are no rules how to commit crimes. And therefore, everyone who wants to engage in war must necessarily admit that he or she will engage in an activity which is governed by rules. And I think this gives us hope, not in the sense of let's hope, but trust that the situation will improve. And now I was asked to say something about peace. I said some things about peace. But, well, I believe, but this time it's more hope, that it is easier to arrive to peace if the rules of IHL have been respected. As a professor, I would like that someone, not a lawyer, historians, political scientists should make a serious study of this to show that in history it was easier to achieve peace if, more or less, because it was never perfectly respected, IHL was respected. What I can testify is, however, is that peace negotiations can often start with negotiations on the humanitarian matters where parties come closer together, find common ground, and can then go beyond. Thank you very much.